Hello and welcome to earlymusicsources.com. My name is Elam Motem, and today we'll talk about common misconceptions about nuns and music. Being a nun, completely isolated behind the walls of a convent, is something we can hardly imagine today. It is fascinating that even in such restricted conditions, many nuns manage not only to excel in music, but also to make a name for themselves and their convents in the outside world. In this episode, we will look at some of the misconceptions often associated with nuns in general and their music making in particular. Since this is a very broad subject, we will focus mainly on nuns from northern Italy in the 16th and 17th centuries. Let's start. Misconception number 1. Those who became nuns were only those who chose to dedicate their lives to God. Well, perhaps some, but many nuns were destined to a life in the convent by their families, as a more affordable alternative to marriage. In those days, to marry off a daughter, her family had to pay the husband's family a dowry, a substantial sum of money. Most of the families of the upper middle class could not afford to marry off all of their daughters, and so they sent many of them to live in convents as nuns. The convent would also charge a dowry, but it was still much cheaper than a dowry for marriage. Once a nun took her vows, she was in most cases not allowed to leave the convent for the rest of her life. Her only contact with the outside world was in the form of family visits behind a screen, not unlike modern prison visits. Although it is hard for us to imagine, becoming a nun was an accepted and normal path of life, with many families sending most of their daughters to convents generation after generation. For example, the singer, organist, and composer Lucrezia Orsina Vizzana, a nun from Bologna, entered the convent when she was barely 8 years old, along with her 11-year-old sister. They were greeted at the convent by no less than 3 of their aunts, who had already spent much of their lives there. With regard to music, in convents where music was valued and practiced, young girls who had received musical training at home or who had a rare musical talent were highly sought after and received a reduction or sometimes even a complete exemption from their dowry. Some of you might think now about the famous Renaissance song La Monica, the Nun. Its melody has been set to many different texts in various languages. But the famous Italian version is about a girl who begs her mom not to send her to the convent and become a nun. Before we'll continue with the misconceptions, Emma Lisa Roux will sing this song for us.
Madre, non mi far monaca, che non mi voglio far, non mi tagliar la tonaca, che non la vuoi portar. Tutti il dì in coro, al vespro ed alla messa, e la madre abadessa non fa se non gridar, che posse la crepar, che posse la crepar.
Misconception number 2. In the convent, all the nuns were equal. Well, no. There was a higher class of the professe and the servant class, the converse. The converse came from poor backgrounds, paid a small dowry to enter, and worked in the menial tasks of the convent. The professe did the things the convent was made for, praying and managing all the activities of the convent. Nuns who participated in music making were of the higher class, and with good musical skills, some lower class nuns could rise to the higher class. Misconception number 3. In church, only men took part in singing and playing polyphony. Nuns, in their cloisters, sang only plain chant, monophony. In many convents, indeed, the musical aspect of the ceremonies performed by the nuns was limited to plain chant. In many others, however, just as in churches run by men, There was, in addition to plain chant, polyphonic vocal music and organ music, which could have been used both as an accompaniment to polyphony and as an alternative instrumental rendering of certain verses. Over the years, we find many instructions forbidding the practice of polyphony in convents while allowing only plain chant. But as in many other cases in this field, the persistence of the prohibition of a particular practice tells us how widespread it was. In some periods, in some convents, polyphony was well accepted. In these cases, there were other prohibitions that focused on what instruments the nuns could play and under what circumstances. For example, playing the organ was almost always allowed, and the nuns were also allowed to have some other keyboard instruments in the room, such as a harpsichord or clavichord. As we will see later, a bass viol was also allowed, but other instruments were often forbidden. Nevertheless, there are records of nuns playing virtually all of the instruments, both in their free time and in the liturgy. Just as a small colorful example, this is a drawing of a certain lute instrument that the nun Angela Confaloniera of a convent in Milan sent to the archbishop of the city to remind him of his promise to send her such an instrument. The archbishop, Federico Borromeo, was a supporter of music and sent her the instrument. When she received it, Confaloniera thanked him very much and reported that she had secretly put together a small ensemble to try it out. It should be noted that nuns, who were required to keep their relations with men to an absolute minimum, did not participate in performances with male musicians. Musical performances in church generally did not mix genders. Misconception number 4. Nuns could not have been educated in music. There were several ways that music education found its way into the closed convents. As mentioned above, some girls from wealthier families had musical training before entering the convent. For example, the nun composers Raffaella Aleotti and Catarina Assandra had both been taught music by serious musicians in their youth, and had already composed and published some of their music before taking their vows as nuns. In the following report from 1565, it is clear that skilled nuns were expected to train their colleagues, but that it wasn't always enough. Almost all the nuns' monasteries have organs inside their church, which are played by one or more of them. Now the nuns educate some girls to continue this task and teach them what they know, but cannot provide them the needed perfection. So, seeking for this purpose a male organist of greater skill and experience than their own, they have asked us to grant them this right, provided, however, that the organist remain in the exterior parlor and the student nun in the interior one with trustworthy companions. Each would have a personal clavichord, with which the organist will teach and the student learn. We see the measures taken to avoid any possibility of unholy relations between nuns and men. The organ lesson takes place beyond a screen with clavichords. This particular request was granted, but many similar ones were denied or simply ignored. Thanks to the repeated prohibition of such teaching scenarios over the years, we know that it was probably quite common. Another way in which the nuns were exposed to outside musical influences was when on special feasts, outside musicians were invited to play in the public church. On these occasions, the nuns could hear, from behind the grills, the latest fashions in music, both in terms of new compositional styles and performance practice. This must have been an important facet of their musical development, as they were otherwise unable to attend performances outside the convent. Lastly, nuns might have received music books from their relatives. However, if the books were not sacred Latin motets, but lascivious vernacular songs, for example, they should make sure to hide them well to avoid severe punishment. Misconception number 5. The nuns' performances were in closed cloisters, so no one could hear them. The nuns were definitely heard. Convents had a public church open to visitors that was connected to an inner church, a chapel for the nuns, accessible only from inside the convent. While the nuns prayed, often singing and playing instruments, they could be heard, but not seen, in the public church. In the Monastero Maggiore in Milan, for example, the public church and the inner church are separated by a wall with a grated screen that reaches high, but not to the ceiling. In the nuns' chapel, there is an organ, and whatever they sang and played could be heard very clearly in the public side. In many other convent churches, the nuns sang in hidden galleries, often more than one, effectively creating a hidden stereo system built into the walls of the church. Convents that produced music that attracted audiences could benefit economically. Good music increased the institution's prestige, attracted rich families to send their daughters there, and invited more people to use their church services. In terms of accessibility, the performances of nuns could have been heard by the general public, while the music of the richest and most prestigious courts in Europe, for example, was enjoyed only by the elite of society. Misconception number 6. Polyphony requires a wide vocal range. Without low male voices, nuns could not have performed polyphony. Nuns definitely performed polyphony, dealing with the lack of low male voices in different ways. The first way is compositionally. While most polyphonic music was written in a range that generally covered the entire gamut, the Renaissance musical system that included 2 octaves and a sixth, there was a specific way of composing with a narrower range called voci pari, equal voices. Such pieces were written in a range of only about 2 octaves, sometimes declared to be specifically for children and indeed for nuns. Here, for example, are the standard vocal ranges of a motet by Cipriano de Rore. It spans 2 octaves and a fifth. And here are the ranges of a contemporaneous anonymous motet, which recent research suggests may have been composed by the princess nun Leonora d'Este. Leonora's motet, like many other motets of the time, is written in voci pari, and you can see that the total range is only 2 octaves. Note that we are not interested in whether the pieces appear to be written high or low. In the Renaissance, singers sang in whatever pitch that was comfortable for them, and that is why the ranges are the important factor. In short, many pieces composed in voci pari, such as this piece by Leonora d'Este, could easily have been performed by female vocal ranges only. With the modern division between men's and women's vocal ranges, another factor that is easy to forget is that some women can sing very low, lower than is socially expected nowadays, and that this was exploited. For example, the abbess of the Murate convent in Florence, who was apparently looking for new potential nuns with low voices, received this letter in 1582. I have not failed to use every diligence to find you a girl with a good bass voice, and I have found one. She will be able to sing all 20 notes of the gamut. She is very poor and has nothing. If you would like to take her, I will keep her here in my house for 1 or 2 months, and then I will send her to you. Apart from the interesting reference to low female voices, it is also a testimony of how musical talent could change a girl's fate by sending her to a convent with high musical standards. As we learned from a slightly later source, when low-singing nuns were not available, another solution was found. Recently, the Vicar General of Milan issued an order that some nuns of this diocese could no longer use musical instruments except the organ and the regale. Now, Since the nuns of Santa Maria Maddalena of Monza in the said diocese find themselves completely without voices that function as bases for their polyphony, they use a violone da gamba for this purpose, having no other choice unless they desist from polyphony altogether. They would like to continue this in order not to deprive themselves of polyphony, and so they have recourse to your illustrious lordships, asking humbly that in light of this need, he allow them to use this instrument. This particular plea to use a bass viol to replace their missing low voices was denied, but from other sources we know that this practice was probably common. Another common aid for missing voices was organ accompaniment. All the voices were played on the organ, and the nuns sang the parts they could. This practice wasn't exclusive for nuns, and took place whenever some singers were absent. When only one part is sung and the rest is played, a pseudo-monody is created, a practice that was very common and was especially mentioned in connection with nuns, although in some places it was sometimes especially forbidden, allowing only group singing for nuns. Lastly, in publications after 1600, there are sometimes notes regarding the possibility for nuns to transpose music that doesn't fit them. For example, in 1610, Romano Micheli wrote that his trios for 2 sopranos and the bass may be performed in different ways, one of which is with the bass part transposed an octave higher for the use of nuns. In another publication from later in the century, the readers are given additional basso continuo parts which are transposed higher, so they will also be appropriate for convents of nuns. Misconception number 7. Whatever nuns did, it was always kept inside the cloister and had no impact on the outside world. The nuns perhaps stayed inside their cloisters, but the names of those who excelled in music traveled far, and made their convents an important attraction for the nobility and other travelers. In another episode, we described how Artusi and Bottrigari were stupefied by the excellent performances of the nuns at San Vito in Ferrara. In fact, this ensemble was so highly appreciated that it was rumored that the Queen of Spain, Margaret of Austria, tried to lure its director, the aforementioned Raffaella Aleotti, into her service at her court. Sometimes, male composers from the outside dedicated their publications to specific nuns, as in the case of Giovanni Paolo Cima, for example, who dedicated his instrumental ricercars publication to the organist and composer nun Caterina Assandra in 1606. A few years later, Assandra published her own compositions, and in the following decades, many other nuns from northern Italy published their music too. These were mainly motets, with some exceptional cases of instrumental music. It should be noted that as opposed to the nuns, female musicians and composers outside the convent had a much harder time legitimizing their professional music making. And so, female composers who published their music were predominantly nuns. An interesting feature of music published by nuns is that it doesn't always represent the music as it would have been performed in the convent by women only. That is, it sometimes includes lower voices together with higher voices, in a way that wouldn't be possible with an all-female ensemble. It may be that these pieces were composed, probably for commercial reasons, to be used by the general public and not exclusively by nuns. Another possibility is that they were originally composed for nuns but rearranged for publication. This was our little introduction to the fascinating world of musical nuns. We hope you enjoyed it. Special thanks to Inbal Prague, Craig Monson, and Laurie Strass who helped me write this episode. Laurie not only contributed immensely to the research of female musicians and composers, but with her group Musica Secreta experimented with how it might have sounded. Don't forget to check the special page on our website with all the footnotes and other extra information. If you enjoy early music sources, feel free to support us on Patreon. Comment, share, and like. See you next time at earlymusicsources.com.